Welcome to Design Notes. I'm Liam Spradlin, and this week I spoke with Nick Butcher, a design and developer advocate at Google. Nick is a designer and a developer, so he has the design chops to envision a great app like Plaid, and the development knowledge to bring it to life. We covered a lot of ground in this episode, from crafting great sample apps to structuring and receiving design feedback, to the role and nature of prototyping tools, and even how to make yourself think in terms of responsive design. Let's get started. Hey Nick, thanks for joining me on Design Notes this week.
Hey Liam, thank you for having me. I've been listening since the first show, so excited to be here.
Awesome. So I guess just tell us a little bit about what you do and kind of your journey to how you got where you are.
Okay, start with a big question. Let's do that. So I am a design and I guess developer advocate at Google with a focus on Android. What that means is I'm in our kind of outreach team, which means it's my job to help third parties to kind of design and build apps on Google's platforms. So I guess to explain that a bit more, it is quite interesting actually to talk about how I kind of got to where I am. So I actually joined Google working on ads, helping people build on top of our AdWords API stuff, which is very important, but totally wasn't something I felt passionate about because I was actually a massive mobile fan already. So I managed to fairly quickly segue onto the Android team, which was, I guess, about 4 years ago, was fairly small, especially in Europe. At the time, it was just Reto Meyer kind of holding down the fort for kind of all of Europe. And I think I just basically kept on asking him Android questions like every day because it was something I was really interested in. And I think to shut me up, he kind of poached me over onto his team. So that was my entrance into kind of Android developer relations. And so for a few years there, I spent a long time kind of helping developers to build Android apps. So especially working with kind of a lot of the European partners, working with like the BBC and the Times and great people like that, awesome partners in Europe, helping them to build apps. But during that time, I guess I kind of really developed an interest in front-end development, especially. You started off being a bit of a jack of all trades, trying to handle everything. And as the team grew, I guess I specialized a little bit more into the kind of the design and front-end development side of things. And it's about the same time like Roman Urich was doing some awesome work. Former guest Roman Urich, I guess I should say, was doing some awesome work in pushing the boundaries forward of talking about design for Android mobile design, and helping to establish patterns and kind of popularize patterns and try and get people to kind of to improve the aesthetic. Because I guess in the early days, like Android was a bit of the Wild West, right? So it really did need a lot of help there. So that became something I got extremely interested in and felt quite passionate about, and started to work almost exclusively on the kind of the front end design and development type stuff. And the last couple of years, as kind of like Android and Google have picked up their design game, both Roman and I have kind of really focused on the fact that we have a lot of machinery. Google has a lot of machinery kind of set up to help developers. Like they've always been quite an engineering focused company. They've got a lot of engineering kind of credibility, I guess. But the same definitely can't be said for designers. We were finding that, in our kind of like work trying to push forward design, that we weren't really set up. There wasn't really the same kind of mechanisms for helping out designers. So we've been pushing quite hard for setting up like what we're now calling design relations, which is happening. So we're trying to create a support system for helping designers out there understand what kind of Android or material design or the Google's kind of platforms that we care about are, and to help them to understand those platforms and design for them, as well as Google. It's a player in the design kind of conversation these days. Like it's not just that we want to help people to understand and implement material design. It's that we kind of, a lot of design work happens at Google, and we feel like we could do a better job of trying to share that with the world, as well as just kind of participate in the kind of current design conversations that are going on. So I think you're seeing that in a lot of things that's going on. Things like the material design site, like google.com/design, SPAN conferences, Google Design on Twitter and on Dribble and on Google Plus and so forth. So so I guess that was a long-winded way of saying that I guess my job is really to help people to kind of understand Google's platforms and design for them, as well as I'm still kind of part developer at heart as well. So I then also try and help people to build that stuff.
Yeah. And so speaking of which, you've done a lot of really cool stuff at Google. The most recent being Plaid, a sample app that you released. It's kind of like a design news app, but it's also a sample for both design techniques and how to develop them. I know that a couple of the apps that I work on have borrowed from Plaid already.
Huh.
But I guess I just want to ask about, in your opinion, what makes a great sample app, both from a design and development perspective?
That's a good question. So let me talk about it through the lens of Plaid, I guess. Like what I was trying to do with that, the reason I kind of built it in the first place. It kind of started off as a way to learn. Like for me, I realized, I learn through doing. I don't really kind of feel like I fully understand like a design principle or an API until I've kind of tried it out and butted up and against the limits and worked out really what it's all about. So I started off when the material design came out, I started writing kind of little sample apps, little throwaway things for myself just to learn the APIs. But the thing about material is it isn't just kind of one API or just one design principle. It's actually kind of a story. It's kind of like when the combination of a number of things come together. So, for example, it's when you kind of get your head around surfaces and how you can use motion to kind of make a surface transform and turn from one thing into another. That you really start to see the benefit that these design principles are talking about weaving together to make this kind of more cohesive, more understandable application. So yeah, I guess I kind of started like putting these little samples together, and I realized that by combining them into a single thing, it actually was more kind of powerful than the sum of the parts. And I actually really started to kind of like really feel the benefit of like the material kind of design principles. So that was one motivation. And the second motivation was that while we've in developer relations have put together a huge number of samples. We have a great GitHub, Google-samples, or Google samples, one word I think, on GitHub. It's got some awesome kind of API demos, as it were. Like they're kind of almost necessarily simple. They kind of focus on one thing, like here's how you use, whatever it might be, the fingerprint API. But they don't really show you how to kind of then use that in conjunction with something else because they're trying to demonstrate one thing. I think the one kind of like main exception to that rule is kind of the Google I/O app, which I've worked on some in the past, which is pulls together a bunch of different APIs and different things to demonstrate how they work together, which is quite powerful. So Google I/O app is great, but it's also become quite a large sample as well. It might be quite hard for developers to get in, and it's also a real app, right? It has to perform a function as well. So it's quite I guess intimidating to get started on, as well as like trying to do everything. So I wanted to put together a sample that pulled together a bunch of APIs, but was still very much focused on UI, on how to implement material design. So that was kind of the motivation for me. So I guess to try and answer your question, what makes a good sample? I guess if it can like demonstrate one thing well, like if it is focused enough to demonstrate one thing, it just happens that with Plaid, that one thing was a larger thing, or maybe a meta thing, a combination of principles, material design principles, that when they came together, it became a larger app. So I guess that's kind of what I consider, a good sample.
Yeah, and you mentioned the I/O app, which is interesting to me because it does combine a lot of different techniques and principles, but it also has a main function. So I know that like building a quote unquote real app, you wouldn't necessarily normally jam all of these things in there functionally because they might not all fit with the product or the experience. So I guess I'm interested in how Google kind of strikes that balance between making it something practical that people can use for the conference and also this extremely rich sample that people can look at.
It's interesting actually because we start off every year working on the I/O app fit with these lofty goals of we want to demonstrate all these wonderful things. Like, for example, this year we're like, we need to add a lot more testing to the application because we need to kind of provide much better samples and guidance examples for people to show how to do that kind of stuff and other such things. And it kind of, like any engineering project, it kind of, you start with these lofty goals and then you get into kind of, the realities of shipping software, of like deadlines and people having other commitments and so on. So we end up, always crunching each year, just like any other software project. So I guess the key thing is like trying to kind of shepherd the project a little bit. So we normally would have one, like a project manager or a PM, or like even just a lead developer who kind of would be doing most of the code reviews or a lot of the kind of like feature kind of shepherding, as it were. Try and like focus on actually saying that each year we're going to try and demonstrate something, we're going to try and ship something, and all the other things which we might want to achieve at the start, maybe they fall by, but we try and achieve something. So for example, last year it was material design. We were like, we were introducing 2014, I should say, we were introducing material design. So it was kind of very, very kind of core to the app experience that it was updated to reflect this kind of fresh new style. I can't remember what we've done in previous years, but I guess it is a really fine line to walk to try and demonstrate a bunch of techniques, but to make sure that they all get through, a rigorous kind of development process until they're in a state that they're good enough to be kind of shared with the world and kind of pointed at as kind of best examples.
Yeah. And something else that's kind of tangential to this topic, but much less concrete, I guess, is the concept of open source design.
Mm-hmm.
So, obviously we're used to seeing code samples and things on GitHub.
Sure.
But I wouldn't say that that's necessarily the case for design resources, right?
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think especially, I'd like to see that change. Would like to contribute to that. So hopefully, I don't think it's gone out yet, but the plan is to open source all the design artifacts for the IO app, for example. So that was one giant sketch file and a bunch of kind of Zeppelin export type stuff. So yeah, that should be going open source. I think it didn't make the first push for Git reasons. It was on the wrong branch or something. But yeah, that should be getting open source. And I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to see people showing their process. Thinking about the industry as it is now, not many people, I think especially designers, feel somewhat reluctant to perhaps show unfinished work. You kind of see that in like, Dribble, perhaps. I don't know, my mind went to that because I think originally the idea of Dribble seemed to be kind of getting feedback, getting kind of like showing your work and then getting feedback in a constructive way. And it seems to over time become, here's something finished which is shiny. Tell me how shiny it is, or it's
right.
become somewhere to get inspiration from rather than to share and get constructive feedback. I think that speaks to perhaps something of the kind of like many designers are kind of perfectionists. I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush. I'm sure that there's ranges here, but many people don't like to show their work. But I think as a learning experience, like we could all learn from each other so much more by sharing the kind of unfinished stuff. One particular exception, for example, that springs to mind is Stammy from Twitter, who is a designer at Twitter who worked on the video project. He did an awesome write-up, fantastic write-up, long blog post where he talked about his process of developing. Like he kind of showed work that they'd thrown away, iterations that they tried and didn't work, and shared videos and prototypes of directions they tried. And I thought that is so much more of a learning experience when you can see how and why they ended up where they ended up, rather than just here's a finished product, go enjoy it. But they actually showed how it was made, and I thought that's such a great learning experience. So it's kind of something I was trying to do with Plaid as well. Like I kind of put it out there a little earlier than I might have intended to. Conferences are a great way of a great forcing function. We were actually speaking at a DroidCon conference in London a couple of weeks back, and I really wanted to share a couple of code samples from the app. So I was like, okay, it's kind of a little way off being ready. It still had like lorem ipsum text in it and so forth. But I wanted to kind of get it out there. But in a way, it's been quite good because I've continued to develop on it. But now all that history is there in the public. Anyone who wants to come and see like how a kind of software feature developed, they can just go and look at the kind of the history on GitHub. It would be nice if there was kind of a similar thing for kind of like design resources as well. Like if you could show some of the directions you tried and discarded and the reasons why.
Yeah. So, and speaking of unfinished work, I know that I'm working on a project right now where I plan to like open source the design. It's not an actual developed product. It's just going to be design files. And I know that I've really had to police myself about that, because I know that my normal like AI files or sketch files, the layers are all over the place. Nothing is organized. So I think it's kind of, it could be compared to code, that, you know, sometimes you might think, oh, I don't want to release this because it's not structured properly, or it's harder to read, which, you know, I think applies to design files as well. But yeah, I agree that work in progress pieces and things from the cutting floor are usually the most fascinating parts of the process.
So how about putting you on the spot? Would you consider sharing it as is and keep on working on it, or do you want to get it to that point?
Well, to your point about conferences being a motivating factor, I'm planning to talk about it at the New York Android meetup next month. So I kind of signed myself up for that as a way of forcing myself to get it done. So it might come to that.
Sometimes we all need a little push.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to, and I can't really explain why. It's, you know, I've been very careful about file structures and stuff, so it's really just...
It is scary stuff, right? You're kind of opening yourself up, right? You're kind of, you know, we all maintain these kind of like public and private personas and profiles and so on. But like when you kind of, you know, show your work, there's no shying away from that. It's like, you know, I'm the same. Like I know the code in Plaid isn't perfect, and I'm sure people can file bugs or look at it code style. Architecture, I know it's a bit of a mess, but like that wasn't what I was trying to demonstrate. So I'm happy kind of putting it out there, and maybe people will look at it and think, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. But hopefully someone else will look at it and learn from it. So yeah, I guess I just try to just get past the fear. You still have it, but like I don't know. Yeah. There's sufficient motivation to get past it.
I think that's a good point too. Like when you work on something that you enjoy, you know, it becomes part of your identity. So you feel personally invested in the project, I guess. So the files that you might share almost become an extension of your perception of your public persona, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really tough. Like, you know the saying, like to try and remove yourself from the work, to try and take the feedback as feedback on the work, not feedback on you as a person. But it's a really hard thing to separate out, especially when you know, IO was the same when we launched it. I sat there watching the comments roll in on G+, people pulling it apart saying, oh, I like this, or I don't like this. And like, you know, for the 100 positive comments and the one negative comment, you come out feeling like crap.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that's very easy to say, but extremely hard to practice.
Yeah, I think realizing that everyone does it. Like, I know talking to Roman Urek, who, you know, someone I work with quite a lot, but like, look up to as, you know, an awesome designer and coder. Hearing him talk about having the same kind of like qualms and fears and doubts kind of thing has been helpful to me to understand that it's a human condition. It's not, you know, you're not unique.
There's some comfort in that, yeah. So I guess back to the note of Google kind of reaching out and, you know, advocating for design more and helping designers. The course on Udacity, I know, has been pretty popular.
So that's the Android design for developers. I think we renamed it to Material Design for Developers, actually, course on Udacity. So yeah, that was still somewhat developer focused. In a way, I'm a little sad that we called the course that, because I feel Material Design for Developers would put off a designer audience who I think could benefit from watching it. But yeah, that's a good course for especially kind of like beginner levels. If you're just getting into Android UI development, or perhaps you're like a designer interested in learning some more about how UIs are actually built, then I think it's a pretty good course. It kind of it's split over 5 lessons where we kind of do a deep dive on the basics of Android, you know, how screens are built, how layout works, how dips and pixels are different, and so on, styles, themes, all that great stuff. And then we take a lesson per material principle. So we go through surfaces, bold graphic design, meaningful motion, and adaptive design. So yeah, there was a lot of work putting that course together, but I would actually quite like to perhaps adapt it one day and make it more accessible, perhaps to designers. Even just having that name, you know, Android Design for Developers or Material Design for Developers, I feel could be a bit off-putting.
Yeah, I definitely fall into the second group of designers who are curious about being an Android. And
it's interesting, isn't it? Because I feel like most designers out there will probably know a little bit of HTML and CSS, right? When did that happen? There was probably a point, like I don't know how many years ago, where if you'd said to them, like, you should, like, perhaps be familiar with CSS and some JavaScript perhaps, and you should be able to, possibly actually committing CSS code to a project, you would have been laughed at. Whereas now that's kind of almost the expectation of web design. Like, what's the future for kind of mobile design? Like, I don't know many designers out there right now who are doing like Android layout or styles and themes, but I can envisage a time when that could be the expectation, or could be part of the kind of future. So I'd be really interested in like any designers like wanting to kind of try that route and get feedback from them on is this a route they want to go, or do we need tooling in between that helps them to break down that kind of like learning barrier? I don't know.
Right. For me personally, I totally want to get there. So I considered the course just material design development for designers. If that makes
nice.
sense.
Awesome. That's a good name. We should perhaps just have the same name. And just like, two front pages which redirect to the same content. How about that?
Yeah. So, but yeah, I think that it is going to become necessary for designers, which is why I want to learn. But so Roman and I have talked about this kind of around this topic a little bit, and about how someday in the magical future of technology, designers will have tools that let them make a design and code comes out that makes the layout work. But I think we're far enough away from that it makes sense to go ahead and have some knowledge now.
So I go back and forth on this, and I think I kind of have the same opinion of prototyping tools. I think like prototyping tools are trying to be like the first step along that journey, it feels to me, right? And I feel like there is huge value in prototyping, because you want to test an idea quickly and cheaply such that you can throw it away without being too attached to it. So you can iterate quickly and try a lot of things out. But for me, because I can code, I find I don't tend to use a lot of prototyping tools. I find I tend to use very low fidelity, kind of like paper and pen, maybe a little bit of Keynote at most, to prototype an idea, and then I'll go straight to the code. Not just because I feel like I'll end up implementing it there anyway, but just because I'm quicker in that. But also because I feel like prototyping tools are trying to grow to encompass every situation, to try and encompass things like responsive design or gestures and animation. And it feels to me like as they keep on growing, they're just approaching code. They're just becoming the final medium which it has to be expressed in. Like, we already have an ability to express things like gestures and things like responsive design through code, and by just making the tooling more and more complex, you lose that kind of quickness, that speed to iteration, and you just approaching the kind of complexity which you were trying to avoid in the first place. So I'd rather kind of cut out the middleman. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that if we were to get to a place where you could design something that encompassed all cases that the code would in any way, to be honest, you've probably just improved the coding tool to that point. Like, you may as well just express it in the final expression, as it were. And
I think that's, Android Studio 2 is kind of helping with that, right?
Yeah, I hope so. I think the layout editor has come a huge way, but I think there's a lot of ground to cover still. We're still giving lots of feedback to that team. There's a long way to go.
Yeah, and I hadn't really considered that angle before about prototyping tools, but it makes sense that eventually the number of actions you'll perform in a prototyping tool to get the desired result from all of these millions of options basically are mimicking code. It's a different input method, I guess.
Yeah, and the people who are super awesome at making prototypes, like if you've worked with some full-time prototypers, there are some people who can be really, really, really quick at putting together a prototype and testing out an idea. I guess I just feel like if I was going to invest the amount of time it probably took them to get to that point, you'd almost be as well off spending that time learning the final expression, the code as it were, to kind of get to the point to be able to make a kind of a real prototype, as it were, like a code prototype. I don't know. Maybe that's an unpopular opinion, but I just feel like I'd rather all the effort going into prototyping tools was going into making, actual coding tools kind of better and meeting kind of halfway, as it were.
Right. So do you think that maybe this this direction that prototyping tools are going in has something to do with, there's a common, I guess I want to call it a myth, but that probably shows my hand, that designers and developers have kind of two different brains. My idealistic mind doesn't want to believe that's true, but I feel like that mentality might be coming through in the kind of tooling that we're doing now.
Let me tack on a kind of a slight walk back onto my last answer as a way of answering this question. I think my opinion is very much coloured by my experience and my skill set. So the reason I see kind of coding as such a viable option is maybe confirmation bias, because I know how to code, right? Like I've done that for a number of years. And so therefore I feel like everyone should know how to code, or it's not that hard, or whatever. I don't know. But I guess in answer to your question, does that mean, like, because I'm coming from a developer side, I see one route as being more plausible, more likely than the other, than a designer side? Like, no, I don't think so. I think one of the things I've struggled and had to realize is that coming from a development background is that there's a lot of mystique around design. I think people kind of see these designers who kind of come in and they think they have some magical taste power or something like that they designers are just born with, and that they have the ability to make something good. And a lot of developers don't understand that it's actually a rigorous skill that can be learned. There is obviously elements of taste which mean you probably get to an intuition or get to a solution perhaps quicker, but it is definitely a learnable skill. And I think that's something that I've had to learn. I mean, I've struggled with calling myself a designer for a long time. For a while, I used to say I'm not a designer, I just play one on YouTube. But now I guess the place I'm at now is that I think that anyone who makes a decision about a product is a designer. And I think developers are making decisions all the time. Like if it's like something that isn't covered in a mock, something that isn't covered in a red line, and they make a decision, then you've made a design decision. You're designing. So that is, I guess, a way of saying I don't think that people are fundamentally different. I think they have different skills, and just because you have a different skill doesn't mean you're not able to learn the other skill, like the design skill for a developer, or vice versa. In fact, I think that when people take the time and effort to understand a bit about design, it's hugely valuable, because I'm not saying they're going to replace the designer in the process, but they'll have this shared vocabulary, this shared understanding, the same language to discuss an issue, which just leads to this awesome improvement in the work when people can collaborate. So I guess it comes down to it depends on the project in a way. If you're working on a huge project, there's probably going to be a degree of specialization, right? So someone's going to specialize and be a super expert on CSS or Android front end or databases or whatever, and someone might be a super awesome expert on motion design. On a large project that might be the case, and those skills might bring to bear on a large project and lead to a better outcome. On a smaller project, perhaps it's one person, perhaps it's two people, and the smaller it becomes, the more you have to be a jack of all trades and kind of work across a bunch of different disciplines. And I feel like it speaks to a little bit how products are changing these days. We no longer have these monolithic giant products. We have super low barriers to entry, which mean to starting a company, to creating a product and launching it and getting to lots of users, which means that teams have to be smaller and faster and so on. And I think that that dynamic kind of very much favors people who know a bit of everything, people who can be sensitive to design but have a strength in development, or people who are have a wide variety of design disciplines under their belt but can do a little bit of development when need be. I feel like I can't remember quite your question because I've been talking for a while, but I don't feel like there's different people. I feel like everyone has the ability to learn these different skills. It just depends on the kind of situation, what your need is to be, how specialized it is you need to be.
That makes sense.
I'm glad. Sorry, I felt like I rambled a little bit there. I'm glad that you think it made sense.
Yeah. As a designer who wants to know how to develop, that's extremely comforting validation. So
Yeah, I mean, just to expand on that a little bit, like I say, I struggled with calling myself a designer, and I've actually worked on a few projects now where I just designed it, and as someone with a development background, that was quite strange to kind of be hands off and give someone a spec or a image and say, like, here you go, off you go, and not just dive into the code and develop it, even if I felt like I could probably could have done it myself or could have done it faster or better or whatever it might be. It was an interesting exercise to try and put myself like in designers I've worked with shoes and understand how they've felt, and I think everyone could benefit from that.
Right, and I think if you are a designer with development knowledge, then you could almost you could certainly make easier the design review process. So when you hand off a fully baked mock and you put it in Zeppelin or redline it or whatever it is that you do, you kind of get back the implementation, and things are never 100% equal because it's, there's noise in the signal, I guess. Yeah. You can't psychically communicate everything that you're thinking on the first try. So there's always the review process. But if you're developing it yourself, then you see that immediately and just do it yourself.
I think it's I think you're exactly right. Like, I feel like getting some overlap between design and development is basically establishing this shared position of like what is kind of acceptable, what you're kind of going for. So, like, for example, one thing I see kind of go back and forth is things like margins, paddings, line spacing. These are things which designers especially are super care about, and they know that these things are important. And perhaps developers have traditionally not always cared or seen that kind of thing. And I think the real kind of like watershed moment comes when you try and explain why they're important, and suddenly you become like you're helping the process rather than being seen as a someone who's nitpicking at work, who's picking up on saying,
right,
you thought you were done with a sprint or a task and you wanted to move on, but like it's, instead of being seen as like someone who's holding you back, you can actually be seen as someone who's like actually moving the project forward. So I feel like developing a shared understanding of like what you're shooting for, like why things are important. And it goes both ways, right? Like a developer can push back and say, oh no, I can't use like padding here because whatever reasons the layout doesn't work like that.
I think I consider that to be a pretty big part of the job of being a designer, I guess, is communicating things like that, why you made certain decisions, being able to say it goes this direction because if it went this direction, X would happen, things like that.
I mean, it'd be interesting to ask you about this as well, because I think a lot of it is about the relationship developed between the designers and developers working together, right? I mean, I've been quite fortunate to work either in both those roles where like you'd hope communication is perfect with yourself, like scaling up to being like co-located with teams where it's easier to kind of share that understanding. I haven't done too much. I've done some, but like remote, where design and development are remote from each other. I know in a bunch of your projects you've worked on, like Focus, for example, you guys, and today you don't like sit with the developer, right? Like, do you feel like distance impacts the ability to develop that shared understanding, or do you feel like we have tools to work around that, you just have to work harder, or what's your take on it?
Honestly, so in cases with like today with Jack or Focus with Francisco, they're both overseas from where I am. So honestly, we use Slack and Hangouts, and that's as close as we can get to physically being in the same place. And I feel like we have a shared understanding of how we need to communicate as far as being detailed and asking questions of each other, which I guess I'm really lucky to have that. But yeah, it is just about communication and constant contact.
Do you feel like that developed over time so that you're now at a place that's better than where you started, that it took a while to understand each other?
I think so, but I think that probably happens in any relationship of this type. So my feeling is that even if we were in person, there's a certain period of, finding out how the other person works and, just kind of establishing that baseline, I guess.
Yeah. I just feel that that's accelerated in person somehow. Like if you can hang out with someone for a day, or even just the coffee conversations where you go to the coffee point and you kind of take 5 minutes outside of your work, I feel like those relationships gel so much quicker, and that can have a huge impact on the communication, that how you get work done with them. So I don't know how we ended up here, but it's an interesting topic.
And I know that, the communication doesn't stop when we're not working. So, I mean, Franco and I send videos back and forth to one another in Slack and everything like that.
Just pure emoticons and GIFs. That's how you communicate.
Exactly, yeah. And then I'll react to the emojis with another emoji.
Of course.
One benefit, I guess, to having this kind of constant remote chat is that it's made me much better at explaining myself. So, like I said, explaining design decisions is a hugely important skill for a designer to have. So having to explain yourself in text is probably one of the hardest ways to do it, I think.
Yes, tone. Lack of tone is tricky.
But, on the other hand, you can sit there and edit the message for as long as you need to before sending it. But, getting the details into words in a way that everyone understands is a challenge that I've thankfully had practice at.
Awesome. So you're going to start blogging these tips on how to get there, I hope, in the spirit of this open source design we were talking about earlier.
That is a really good idea, actually.
Any techniques to put you on the spot right now that you've developed that help to kind of communicate your design decisions? Like, do you try and avoid using text and try and use, videos or something? Or any tips there?
So there are certain things, depending on what stage we're at. If it's like an initial proposal, then I'll usually make some kind of document. Like before we're at the spec stage, I'll make some kind of document with little markers explaining the key important aspects of it. And then I usually find, there are some questions that you can answer that way right away before the person you're working with has a chance to ask them. But then, other questions always come up, and, sometimes I have already thought about it and I have an answer, and sometimes I don't. But I think both are productive. I guess I would say just trying to answer as many questions as you can up front of things that are important to the design, if that makes sense.
So you communicate that mostly through static images and kind of supporting text. You're not really one for building, After Effects prototype or something like this.
Oh, I definitely spend far too much time in After Effects, which some people would say is a debate of its own, but I do like making motion comps, especially for things that... So recently I was working on a project that one of the screens had this kind of bottom sheet mechanic where there's a sheet that was always present at the bottom, and you can slide it up and it snaps at a certain place. So that's something that you can't really communicate in text.
Yeah.
And
you find yourself just making descriptive noises, I feel like it's the best thing right now.
Right,
goes, whoop,
right.
like that. And that
Exactly.
expresses it perfectly, right?
Right. So even the world's most talented developer, whoever that is, would never be able to guess what my intentions were. So I think in that case, it's important to make at least a motion sketch, a prototype if it's possible, but that goes back to, prototyping tools have a million options, but not this one extremely specific option that I need for this one screen on this one project. So I guess, if you don't know how to code, the best I can do is probably a motion sketch. Yeah,
I think I've tended to draw the line at saying, how much effort it would be for me to... I'm not super awesome with After Effects, so I'd like either try and do it in Keynote to express something like that, or I'd say, look at this app or whatever. If you want a bottom sheet, there's one in Plaid. You can just steal it. It's fine.
There you go. But yeah, it's interesting because that's one of the things, like typography or like type design, where the overall product looks pretty simple and cohesive, but in the process of making it, there are a lot of small things you can do that will totally ruin the effect.
Yeah, simplicity's hard.
Yeah. Yes. I guess that's what I'm trying to say in a longer roundabout way.
Have you designed a type before?
I have. I designed Geode. It took me
Wow.
about 10 months, and I'm not really happy with it, to be honest. I'm planning an update once, there's 1,000 back burners, right?
Uh-huh.
But
That's impressive. Like, that was a monumental amount of work to design a typeface. I'm in awe.
It's a very informative process. I mean, it really, even if what you come out with, like Geode, I would not put against any, I guess, famous typefaces that you could probably name. But the process itself was hugely informative of just being thoughtful about design decisions and seeing how things work together. Especially the best design typeface can look terrible if your spacing is off. And there's no math that will definitely solve that,
Yeah, setting type is something I'm still very rookie at. Like I have a lot of respect for people who, you see someone who sets a page and it just feels right. It just feels extremely balanced. You can't necessarily place your finger on it and say, oh, I like the line spacing you've used here, or the letter spacing you used there, or whatever treatment you used there. But it just feels right. It just feels great. I definitely know that's a weakness. I'm trying to work on that and improve that, and kind of reading up on kind of some of the great kind of typography books to try and improve on that. But that's one area that once you kind of start peeking behind the curtain of what goes into good typography is a hugely impressive and almost also intimidating kind of spin.
Certainly intimidating. I'm intimidated by it.
But hugely rewarding, right? Because I feel like, most of the information you're probably trying to convey is written. So anything you can do there to kind of help focus attention and convey hierarchy and ease the reading experience is going to be beneficial.
Yeah. And, making a typeface, like anything else, it's just exciting when someone uses it. But yeah, the invisible design decisions that can't be accurately determined by math, it's kind of the delight and the frustration of typography.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. Like, some designers kind of are very kind of heavily reliant on maths, and they feel like anything which uses a formula or uses the golden ratio or something like that is inherently superior. And some designers seem to be more gut-based kind of thing. They kind of just do things because it feels it's right. I guess I kind of probably fall nearer the former camp, but not always. I guess I do like my baseline grids and making sure things are kind of following an order. But there's sometimes where you just have to break out of it, and you don't know exactly why, but you just knew that had to be needed more room to breathe, or that needed to be off grid for some reason. So
yeah, I have to say the fact that all the text in Plaid aligns to the 4dB grid is one of my favorite features. But I think it's important to start from the math and then make decisions out of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, deviate with purpose, I guess, is what we say about design guidelines, right? They're a good starting point, but they're not rules, they're guidelines. So you kind of start from a sensible place, and then when you deviate, you do so because you have a reason, not just because you felt like it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it takes me back to our Android Design in Action days. Gosh, that feels like a long time ago that we're doing that show. I think deviate with purpose was one of our mantras.
Yeah, speaking of that, the kind of design instruction or feedback, I always think that design feedback is super interesting. Mm-hmm. So I know that you do a lot of that at Google. I guess I would say, how do you think about providing feedback to different audiences, I guess, or how to structure it?
Yeah, it's an awesome question, actually, because it's something that doesn't get thought about enough. I think the first thing is a tip we actually learned on doing that Android Design Action show from Alex Farborg. He kind of shared with us that the thing you show to get feedback on, like the fidelity of something that you show, is hugely impactful on the kinds of feedback you're likely to get from it. What I mean is, if you show someone a high fidelity Photoshop mock-up of a screen, right, that you're going to get feedback on that blue isn't quite right, that line should be 2 pixels to the right. Whereas if you show someone a hand-drawn sketch of the same screen, you'll get feedback like, oh, I don't think you should have this information here, or this should probably be reversed, or something like that. Like the medium, like people kind of, I don't know, intuit how much effort you've put into creating it, and like use that almost as a filter on the kind of feedback. They're like, oh, they've got this far, they're not going to take feedback on like the fundamentals of the screen, probably.
Right.
So I think that's my first kind of interesting tidbit is like, yeah, to think about the level of the feedback you give, because, for example, in my role, we've given, we work with companies out there and give them feedback on their apps and make suggestions and so on and so forth. And one thing I used to do in my youth and enthusiasm would be like, someone would send an app and I'd compose this like Google Doc of like 6 pages of feedback of like all the stuff which, I would see as suggestions, improvements, whatever, and thinking I was being super helpful. But really, like, if you think about it from the other side, on the receiving end of that, that's super intimidating. That's like, oh my gosh, like, we put something together which we thought was pretty good, and we got like all this stuff back. So I guess there's like, coming back to that element of conveying tone as well. It's like, you've got to think about like giving feedback which is kind of in the right kind of level and the right kind of medium for the stage that they're at. So yeah, for giving feedback, I'd always rather someone told me, hey, this is super early, I'd love some feedback on the idea, or hey, we're pretty far along, I'd love some feedback on this interaction or this visual or something like that. So I feel like, yeah, I guess it's kind of, as we we're talking about before, it kind of comes back to communication, right? So as long as you have that good communication, talking about, the expectations, so both parties have like, aligned expectations.
Yeah, that's interesting. Your first point about the fidelity of your product determining what kind of feedback you get also applies to a person in a role like mine, where I'm, creating designs for other organizations. So my instinct as someone who is very fast about sketching high fidelity things, my instinct is to go for that and show them something as realistic as possible, but you can possibly poison the end result by doing that, because you might not get the kind of fundamental feedback about the basic foundations first.
So have you ever walked it back and, put together something with grey boxes rather than something higher fidelity, even though you could perhaps do the higher fidelity quicker?
I think I have. I have definitely intentionally stopped myself from making something detailed in an effort to just get a mechanic or an idea down. I'll still make it in Illustrator because I can't stop. I can't break my addiction.
Sketch, dude. You got to go sketch.
Yeah, I've been transitioning. I really have been trying. But yeah, and as far as intimidating lists of feedback, I feel like I've definitely done that before. So yeah, I guess it does kind of help that both parties go into it with certain expectations about what they're going to receive and what you should be looking at to give.
Yeah, one of my awesome colleagues at Google, Timothy Jordan, he actually has a acting background, and he actually gave an awesome lightning talk talking about how actors give feedback. I wish I could remember all of the salient points, but it was very, very interesting. But as as a craft which is developed and where giving feedback to actors is like directly leads to the quality of the production they put on stage, it was really interesting to learn from that completely different sphere about different tips for giving feedback. And definitely that was something. It was a lot about expectations. It was a lot about how you express something to someone rather than just the pure content, and trying to remember that everyone's just trying to make something good, trying to be beneficial. I encourage people to look up how actors give feedback as a as a tool.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of tying your work to your identity, I think acting is an extremely valid example of that.
Yeah, you are very much a representation of your product then.
Yeah. So Earlier you mentioned adaptive design,
Yes.
and that is something that is becoming ever more critical. And I have my own ideas about this, which I'll be publishing with the open source design. But I want to hear about kind of planning for adaptive design. I know that ever since attending SPAN, I've made a point to design tablets at the same time as I design phones. But assuming that's all that the project involves, it doesn't involve cars or televisions or whatever. But there are more than 2 screen sizes. So when beginning a design and keeping adaptive design in mind, is there anything you know of that is a better way to account for all the sizes in between?
That's a very expansive question, which I'm still struggling with, to be honest with you. Like, I feel like right now we're in the infancy of having good solutions. I mean, right now, some of the best solutions tend to be, you go from 1 column to 2 columns, or you restack elements, or you reflow elements. I feel like we're in our infancy of developing these patterns. I feel like kind of we, not mature, but we're slightly further along with a bunch of kind of like, portrait phone pattern type things, and that we haven't quite kind of gotten to a place where there's like, prescriptive things that you can use to kind of take off the shelf. That said, there's a lot you can do by just like by trying to force yourself to think like this. So as a concrete example, so one thing I always do, one technique I've developed is when I'm building an application, I no longer ever hard code any dimensions into my layouts. I only use dimensions files, and I always you can see an example of this in Plaid. In fact, I always set up some initial building blocks. So I have like padding normal be 16 dip, and spacing normal be like 8 dip for an 8 dip grid, and spacing triple will be like 24, or quadruple will be like 42, or whatever it might be. And then I'll only refer to these because then that gives me the power to like vary those baselines by size. So I'll generally set up something like 560 dip or something like that. I'll vary the kind of the padding normal will go up from 16 to 24, and all of a sudden all of your designs are suddenly responsive by just always building on these common units. They kind of factor these things into it. So that's one technique which I've tried to adopt, which has forced me to never think about a single screen size, because I know that as soon as I type that word like padding normal in my brain, it's registering that doesn't necessarily mean 16 dip. That means 16 dip in this configuration, but it means 24 dip in that configuration, and it means 32 dip in this other configuration. So that's one technique I've tried to use. Another technique which has been quite helpful, again on the development side, is it's just deploying to 3 devices at once. So Android Studio does this thing when you hit run, it has this device chooser, but some people don't know that you can just hit like Command A, Control A, whatever, to select all devices that are attached. So I'll frequently will just have a USB hub plugged into my computer, and I'll have normally a Nexus device because I have those at hand. I'll have like a phone-sized device, a small tablet, and a large tablet connected at once. And whenever I'm building, I'll just deploy to all 3 at once, which is a fun way of forcing yourself to realize when you've broken stuff, or a design just doesn't work, or when you've let something be match parent, which is going to be way too wide on certain devices. So those are a few like practical things I've started doing. Don't look at Plaid on a tablet because I haven't done that enough. But yeah, like I say, I just feel like we're at the infancy and we need to develop these patterns of how content adapts. It's great to see some of the material guidelines start to touch on that. I think there's a lot more coming. I know the team want to work on that, want to flesh that kind of adaptive design section out a lot more and try and provide some patterns that seem to be work. Right. But yeah, there's no silver bullet. Like I think that designing for 2 screens at once is pretty tricky. Luckily, code is necessarily a bit more flexible, the way it can kind of factor out and reach out to like dimension files and so forth to kind of express itself in multiple ways at once. So I guess that kind of speaks to my process a little bit, where I kind of go straight from low fidelity paper to a code kind of like artifact. It helps me, I guess, to try and write code, always thinking about the different sizes it's going to run at.
Right. And I guess the other half to that is, so there's the practical side of actually implementing a design across multiple form factors. But then there's also like the experience side. So you can make decisions about, how much information do I want on a certain screen, on, a certain screen size. But I guess I often question, and I guess it's really per project, but I often question how similar the experiences need to be, or how much they can deviate and still be a consistent representation of the same product, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think I kind of like the word responsive design, because it's not just responding to screen size, right? I mean, that's not the only input you need to respond to, or difference in configuration. I think you can infer differences based on other stuff as well. So, for example, a watch is going to be used in a different context, or you could say that a tablet is likely to be used in a different context to a phone, right? So you can kind of try and intuit some cues from that. So you might say that a tablet might be more of a sat down, relaxed, longer session type thing, and given those likely scenarios, that you might change the information you're presenting or the way you present it, as opposed to a phone or a watch, which is very much more of a snacking experience where you're kind of in and out. So yeah, I think responsive is kind of larger than just screen size. I think, like I say, at the moment we're kind of like reaching around for these patterns where there aren't these established cues, because just because you're on a tablet doesn't mean you're sat on a sofa. It could be, I don't know, someone in Piccadilly Circus taking a photo, even though you shouldn't do that on a tablet. But yeah, at the moment we're trying to kind of like reach around in the dark, as it were, for these kind of like subtle cues as to different use cases, because we don't have perfect input to understand the situations all the time. But I still think it's a laudable effort to try and intuit some of these things.
Right. That's an interesting point about, we might think of tablets as a device you use on the couch, but that's not the case for everyone. So it is interesting to think about. And I guess it really comes down to our best effort can be made with data, I guess.
Yeah, it comes back to research, really, and empathy, really, because if you don't do any research, or you don't attempt to kind of empathize with how other people are using it, then all you have is your own use cases to fall back on, and you're designing something which works perhaps well for you, but perhaps doesn't find market fit. So research is just everything, right?
And I know that I'm the most boring user in the world, so I've learned that I can't rely on my my use case instincts based on my own experience, because they are not representative of anybody anywhere. So that is interesting. I mean, like in Focus, for instance, users have asked for features that I had never heard of or thought about, or
like what?
even
Give us an example.
So I guess I've thought about this one, but one feature request that we get a lot is the ability to rename photo files and move them around between folders, which to me, as the most boring user in the world, I've never done that. And I assume that a file manager would do that job or something, if that's what I was going for. But, and Focus is kind of built to kind of shield the user from having to do that. Like the goal is that you wouldn't have to do that in the first place. And we're not all the way there yet, but digging into it further to figure out, like, why do users want this? People were saying things like the real goal that one user had was to reorder photos, and that's why they wanted to rename the files, to put them in a certain order. So that's something that I never thought of, but I guess it gets me to another point, which is sometimes when you get feedback on something, the person delivering the feedback might think that they have discovered this problem, or this unsolved scenario, when in reality, what they have said is not the root of the issue.
Mm-hmm.
So in reality, they might be trying to accomplish a goal that is not explicitly stated in the feedback. So I think that there are really cool opportunities there if you can jump back to the root issue and then solve that in perhaps an even smarter way.
That's excellent, yeah. But I think it all starts with data as well, right? Because I think the more you kind of data you collect, the more people you talk to about your product, or the more you listen to feedback, you'll start to see these clusters, right? And you kind of feel like there's something around reordering going on, right? One person said this, one person said that, but you can kind of like start to realize the cluster around a certain topic. And I think, that's where data becomes really useful. In my role, I haven't had enough opportunity or chance to do research, but it's the few times I have, I've found like having real data to work with being like pretty kind of illuminating.
Right. And so like working on a big project, you might have the budget to do user acceptance testing and have real people come in and use the product in front of you and see what they do and how they think about it. But even something like just going to the community on Google Plus or Reddit or wherever your market is can be very valuable qualitatively, at least.
Yeah, I think beta communities on Google Plus and so forth are a pretty valuable way to do it. I mean, I know you've had Kevin from Nova Launcher, right, who spoke very highly about what that's allowed them to do. So I think that's a great kind of way of collecting feedback from your most engaged users. I think any route to data is definitely awesome.
Right, and that audience is often the most enthusiastic about having input, and they have an interest in making the product better, which is something that you likely will not run into with like randomly sampled users for formal testing.
It's an interesting situation. As someone like in my role in developer relations, I haven't really had much opportunity to do that kind of thing. It's often fire and forget, as it were. Like we kind of put out IO shared and then move on to the next engagement. Working with a partner here and then move on another one. I think it's something. When you have a relationship with a product and you're working on it, improving it, and seeing it grow, I think that's a super interesting dynamic to kind of like work out the best way to get to the most passionate users and get that feedback, and then to again, getting it is one thing, but then filtering it to try and get those nuggets of insights, like you say, is super hard.
Right. I actually think it's kind of addictive. If it were up to me, I would stay with every product I've worked on for the rest of my life. Which is obviously not feasible, but it's a rewarding process for sure.
Yeah, no, I get that. Like, I think I keep on speaking about Plaid, but mostly it's just because it's kind of top of mind. I guess it's the thing I've been working on the most lately. I'm kind of regretful that I launched it with an open beta, because I thought this is a new feature that launched, so you don't have to sign up to a community. I thought lower friction, great, get more people might be like interested in trying it. But I feel like that's come at a huge cost, that there's now no obvious place to give me feedback. So some awesome people have gone to the GitHub page and filed issues, or even submitted pull requests, which has been fantastic. But yeah, I feel like I kind of shot myself in the foot a little bit there. So I'm actually considering when I go public, when I launch it properly public on the Play Store, to actually close the open beta and then open a regular beta with the kind of feedback community, because I feel like I'm missing out on all this feedback right now. Yeah,
it is an awesome tool. So I think that actually wraps it up for this episode. Thank you again for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of ground, I think. So,
so sorry if we got a bit ranty in the middle there, but we have strong feelings about design workflows.
Yeah, and hopefully the listeners' ears are not bleeding from my lovely allergies voice today.
Oh, well, get well soon, Liam.
Thanks. But until next time, I'll talk to you later.
Cheers. Bye.